The rain over Manhattan was a silver curtain, weeping down the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse in jagged, glittering rivulets. From 60 stories up, the city was a muted tapestry of blurred headlights and neon smears, silenced by 3 inches of bulletproof acoustic glazing. Inside, the air was climate-controlled to a sterile, perpetual 68 degrees, carrying the faint, expensive scent of ozone and white lilies. Elena Vance stood with her back to the skyline, her attention anchored to the array of curved, ultra-high-definition monitors that dominated the far wall of her study. She did not care about the glittering heart of New York City. She cared about the rust and the soot bleeding across the screens in front of her. On the center monitor, the Vance Ironworks of western Pennsylvania lay dying. Through the lens of a high-altitude drone and a dozen strategically compromised security cameras, Elena watched the sprawling 300-acre industrial carcass. It was the cathedral of the American Rust Belt, a jagged silhouette of smokestacks and corrugated steel roofs that looked like open wounds against the gray afternoon sky. The once mighty blast furnaces, which had burned with the fury of captured stars for nearly a century, now operated at a miserable fraction of their capacity. The rail yard was half empty, the surviving flatbeds loaded with oxidized scrap. Elena took a slow sip of her black coffee. The porcelain cup was warm against her pale, manicured fingers. She traced the rim, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the cold digital glow of the screens. "The bank's foreclosure deadline is in exactly 47 minutes, a voice said from the shadows of the room. Marcus Thorne stepped into the soft pool of light cast by the monitors. He moved with the predatory grace of a corporate shark who had long ago traded his conscience for bespoke Italian tailoring and a corner office. His charcoal suit absorbed the light, and his silver tie was knotted with mathematical precision. In his right hand, he held a sleek, titanium-cased tablet. 47 minutes, Elena repeated, her voice a smooth, frictionless purr. "And how is my dear uncle holding up under the pressure?" Marcus tapped the glass of his tablet. "Camera 4, the administrative office." On the lower left monitor, the feed flickered and enlarged, filling the screen with the grainy interior of a wood-paneled office that hadn't seen a renovation since 1988. There, hunched over a scarred mahogany desk, was Arthur Vance. Elena stepped closer to the screen, her breath ghosting against the glass. Arthur looked small. The years of inhaling iron dust, cheap cigars, and the crushing weight of impending bankruptcy had hollowed him out. His silver hair was disheveled, and his broad, working-man's shoulders were slumped beneath a faded corduroy jacket. He was surrounded by mountains of manila folders, final notices, and an empty bottle of cheap bourbon. As she watched, Arthur buried his face in his hands, his knuckles white with an impotent, silent desperation. A sharp spike of satisfaction, cold and jagged as broken ice, pierced Elena's chest. "Look at you," she thought, the memory of his booming, dismissive voice echoing from a decade ago. "Look at the titan of industry, reduced to a beggar in a crumbling castle." "He's been on the phone all morning," Marcus noted, stepping up beside her, his gaze analytical. "He begged the creditor committee for an extension. He tried to leverage the union pension fund. He even called a state senator he bribed back in 2006. No one is returning his calls. The debt is $42.5 million. The principal is due at 5 o'clock Eastern, or the locks go on the gates tomorrow at dawn." "The arrogance of the man," Elena murmured, her eyes locked on Arthur's trembling hands. He truly believed the Vance name was enough to hold back the tide of cheap foreign steel and his own gross incompetence. "He exiled me from this family because I told him the fire was dying. He told me a woman with a ledger could never understand the soul of a forge." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Let us see how much soul he has left when the fires go out." "Do we let it burn, then?" Marcus asked. His tone was perfectly neutral, the voice of a man who facilitated ruin for a living. If we do nothing, the bank seizes the assets. The ironworks is auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. Arthur loses everything. No, Elena said sharply, tearing her gaze away from the broken man on the screen. If the bank takes it, Arthur is merely a victim of the economy, a tragic martyr of the Rust Belt. I will not afford him that luxury. I don't want him destroyed by a faceless institution, Marcus. I want him to owe his survival to a ghost. I want him to wake up every morning in that soot-stained office, breathing a sigh of relief, completely unaware that the noose around his neck is held by me. Marcus smiled, a thin, razor-like expression. The phantom benefactor. Precisely. Is the architecture in place? It is. Marcus handed her the titanium tablet. The funds have been laundered through 3 distinct sovereign territories. They currently reside in a holding account under the name Obsidian Capital, a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, wholly owned by a blind trust in Zurich, which is, in turn, controlled by your holding company. There is absolutely no paper trail connecting Elena Vance to the transaction. To the bank and to Arthur, Obsidian Capital is merely a predatory investment firm with a sudden, inexplicable interest in distressed American manufacturing. Elena looked down at the tablet. The screen displayed a secure banking interface, the digits glowing in a crisp, unforgiving green. Transfer amount, $42,500,000 US. Destination, First Pennsylvanian Commerce Bank, escrow, Vance Ironworks. Authorization required, $42.5 million. It was a staggering sum to the common man, a lifetime of unimaginable wealth. To Elena, it was merely the ante in a high-stakes game of blood and vengeance. She had spent the last 10 years building a fortune in venture capital, ruthlessly dismantling technology startups and liquidating their assets. She had become a master of the very ledgers Arthur had mocked. Now she was bringing the war home. If we execute this, Marcus cautioned, his voice dropping an octave, Obsidian Capital absorbs the debt. You won't just be stalling the foreclosure. You will become the primary lien holder. You will own the mortgage on the ironworks, the land beneath it, and the patents on the Vance alloy. Arthur will technically still be the CEO, but he will be operating entirely at your mercy. If he misses a single payment, which he will, you can seize the company without a public auction. I don't just want the company, Marcus, Elena said softly, her eyes returning to the live feed of the sprawling, rusted facility. She watched a burst of orange sparks erupt from the side of a distant smelting pot, a beautiful, violent display of heat and friction. I want to watch him bleed for it. I want him to think he has been granted a miracle. I want him to pour his last ounce of hope, his last drop of sweat, into keeping that mill alive, believing he can outrun the debt. And when he is finally exhausted, when he has given everything he has left, I will step out of the shadows and take it from his hands. She placed her thumb over the biometric scanner at the base of the tablet. The device hummed, a tiny LED flashing from red to green. Beep. Authorization accepted. Initiating transfer. A loading bar appeared on the screen, crawling from left to right as millions of dollars pulsed through encrypted fiber optic cables beneath the Atlantic Ocean, bouncing through servers in Geneva, bouncing again through the Caymans, before finally striking the eastern seaboard of the United States. Elena handed the tablet back to Marcus and crossed her arms, her posture rigid, her breathing perfectly controlled. "Watch," she whispered. On the lower left monitor, the scene in Arthur Vance's office remained a portrait of despair. The digital clock in the corner of the camera feed read 4:21 p.m. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, thick with anticipation, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass behind them. At 4:23 p.m., the heavy, black rotary phone on Arthur's mahogany desk suddenly began to ring. Even without audio, the violent startle in Arthur's body was painfully obvious. He jerked upright, staring at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. His hand hovered over the receiver for 3 rings. Slowly, with the trembling hesitation of a condemned man, he picked it up and pressed it to his ear. Elena leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, absorbing every micro-expression on her uncle's face. She saw his brow furrow in confusion. She watched his lips move, forming a silent, disbelieving who? Then, she saw the exact moment the bank manager on the other end of the line confirmed the wire transfer. Arthur's posture changed. The slump in his shoulders evaporated. His eyes went wide, wide and frantic, staring blindly at the peeling wallpaper of his office. He stood up from his leather chair, the phone gripped so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. He mouthed the words, "Paid in full?"
Elena smiled.
It was a terrifying expression, devoid of any real warmth. It was the smile of a spider feeling the first, desperate vibration of a fly in her web. On the screen, Arthur dropped the receiver back onto its cradle. He fell back into his chair, covered his face, and began to weep. It was an ugly, profound weeping, the kind born of impossible relief. He thought he had been saved. He thought the heavens had parted and granted the Vance legacy a second chance. "It is done," Marcus said quietly, slipping the tablet into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "The bank has cleared the funds. The foreclosure is officially suspended. Obsidian Capital is now the master of the Vance Ironworks." "Excellent work, Marcus," Elena replied, not looking away from the screen. She reached out and touched the cool glass of the monitor, right over the digitized image of Arthur's weeping face. The heat of the Pennsylvania forge seemed a million miles away from the freezing, immaculate heights of her Manhattan penthouse, but Elena could almost smell the sulfur. She could almost taste the iron dust on the back of her tongue. The ghosts of her past were screaming in the roar of those blast furnaces, demanding restitution for the years of humiliation and exile. "Schedule a board meeting for Obsidian Capital next week," Elena commanded, turning away from the monitors at last. She walked toward the wet glass of the window, looking out over the glittering, rain-slicked city that she had conquered. "Draft a letter of introduction to Arthur Vance. Keep it corporate, keep it cold. Inform him that his new creditors expect a full audit of his operational inefficiencies by the end of the month." "He will fight the audit," Marcus warned. "He is notoriously secretive about the floor operations." "Let him fight," Elena said, her reflection in the window looking back at her with eyes made of flint and frost. "Every time he fights, he will tighten the collar around his own neck. We will drain him, Marcus. Slowly, systematically, we will let him manage the rust while we control the iron." Marcus nodded, a gesture of absolute obedience. "And when he finally demands to meet the head of Obsidian Capital face to face?" Elena picked up her coffee cup, taking one last, bitter sip. The rain lashed against the glass, a furious storm breaking over the city. "When the time is right," Elena whispered into the quiet room, her voice a promise forged in the darkest shadows of her heart. "I will go to Pennsylvania, and I will watch him realize that the savior who gave him his life back is the very same girl he threw to the wolves." The cursor blinked on the glowing monitor, a rhythmic, mocking pulse in the dim, dust-choked air of the overlooking manager's office. Arthur Vance sat frozen in his leather chair, the cracked upholstery groaning under his weight as he stared at the banking portal. The numbers on the screen were impossible, a digital hallucination rendered in stark, unforgiving white against the black background of the ledger. $4,250,000. Status: cleared. Origin: Equinox Capital Partners. Arthur's hands, calloused and mapped with the pale scars of a lifetime spent working hot iron, trembled. He dragged a grease-stained thumb across his jaw, feeling the gray bristles that had sprouted there since he had stopped caring about his reflection. The money was a lifeline. It was a miracle. It was the exact sum required to satisfy the creditors, overhaul the failing number 4 drop forge, and keep the pensions of 70 loyal men from evaporating into the cold Michigan air. And Arthur knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent his life reading the structural integrity of metal, that it was poisoned. There had been no negotiations, no handshakes in sterile boardrooms. Just a single, unmarked envelope slipped under the rusted corrugated door of the loading bay 3 days ago, containing a contract with terms so seemingly generous they defied the brutal logic of modern economics. The phantom benefactor had asked only for a lien on the property, a formality the cover letter had claimed. But Arthur wasn't a fool. He knew men like Marcus Thorne operated in the shadows, orchestrating corporate cannibalism through webs of shell companies. Equinox Capital had Thorne's distinct, bloodless fingerprint all over it. Arthur closed his eyes. The rhythmic, concussive thud-thud-thud of the stamping presses vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up his boots and settling in his aching spine. The sound was the heartbeat of Vance Heavy Industries, but lately, the rhythm had grown arrhythmic, wheezing, dying. "God forgive me," Arthur whispered to the empty room. He reached forward and clicked accept transfer. Down on the factory floor, the air was a suffocating soup of vaporized coolant, ozone, and sweat. The ambient temperature hovered near 90 degrees, despite the chill of the autumn rain lashing against the high, frosted clerestory windows. High above the grinding machinery, Elena Vance stood on the grated steel catwalk, looking down at the belly of the beast. She wore steel-toed boots that felt alien on her feet, a pair of baggy, fire-retardant coveralls, and a yellow hard hat pulled low over her forehead. Clear safety glasses with thick, distorting side shields obscured the sharp, aristocratic lines of her cheekbones, traits inherited from a mother who had fled this soot-stained purgatory 2 decades ago. Clipped to her breast pocket was a laminated badge. Evelyn Cross, Apex Risk Management. Elena tightened her grip on her aluminum clipboard, her knuckles turning white. She had not stepped foot inside Vance Heavy Industries in 8 years. Not since the screaming match in the driveway. Not since she had packed her bags and chosen the sleek, bloodless skyscrapers of Manhattan over the rust and ruin of her father's crumbling empire. Now she was back, sent as a ghost to survey the graveyard. Marcus Thorne, her boss and the architect of her father's sudden, miraculous windfall, had dispatched her to assess the physical assets before the jaws of his trap snapped shut. "Go down there, Elena," Thorne had purred from the shadows of his penthouse office. "Put eyes on the collateral. Your father thinks he's been thrown a life preserver. I want to know exactly how much the ship weighs before I pull it under." Looking down at the sprawling floor, Elena felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. The factory was dying. She could see it in the oxidized veins of the overhead cranes, in the flickering, dying halide lamps that cast long, monstrous shadows across the concrete. The workforce, once a bustling army of 300, was reduced to a skeleton crew of graying men moving with the lethargy of the condemned. Sparks showered like dying stars from the welding bays in the corner, briefly illuminating a figure walking out from beneath the shadow of the manager's office stairs. "Arthur." Elena's breath hitched. She pressed herself back against the greasy railing, observing him from 30 feet above. The physical toll his failures had taken on him was staggering. When she had left, Arthur Vance had been a pillar of a man, broad-shouldered and unyielding, a titan forged in the very furnaces he commanded. Now he looked hollowed out. His shoulders sloped beneath a faded canvas jacket. His gait, once commanding, was now a painful asymmetrical shuffle. She watched as he paused by the massive crucible of the smelting furnace. He reached out to pat the scarred iron flank of the machine, a gesture of profound, tragic intimacy. Then Arthur bent double, gripped by a sudden, violent coughing fit. The wet, rattling sound carried over the din of the machinery, echoing off the high tin roof. A wave of bitter regret washed over Elena, threatening to break her composure. This is what pride buys you, she thought, forcing the cold, analytical part of her brain to the forefront. He could have sold this place 10 years ago. He could have retired. Instead, he let it eat him alive. She needed to get closer. She needed to see if the man she remembered was entirely gone, or if there was still enough fight left in him to survive what Thorn was about to do. Elena descended the narrow spiral staircase, her boots ringing against the metal. By the time she reached the floor, the heat wrapped around her like a wet, heavy blanket. She navigated the labyrinth of cooling vats and stacks of raw steel billets, her eyes fixed on Arthur, who was wiping his mouth with a greasy rag, his chest heaving. "Mr. Vance?" she called out, projecting her voice over the hiss of a pneumatic valve. Arthur turned, his brow furrowing as he took in the stranger in the oversized coveralls. His eyes, the same striking, piercing blue as her own, narrowed in suspicion. "Floors restricted to personnel. Who let you back here?" Elena stepped into the pool of light cast by a hanging bulb, keeping her chin tucked. "Evelyn Cross, Apex Risk Management. I checked in with your foreman at the loading dock. I'm here to conduct the preliminary safety and asset audit for your new underwriters." Arthur's posture stiffened. The mention of the underwriters, the phantom string attached to his new millions, acted like a galvanic charge to his spine. He stood a little taller, trying to summon the ghost of his former authority. "Ah, right. Equinox. They didn't tell me they were sending someone out this quickly." "Capital moves fast, Mr. Vance," Elena said, her voice smooth, deliberately pitching it half an octave lower than her natural speaking tone. "And investors like to know what they're paying for. They're paying for the best damn ironworks in the tri-state area," Arthur said defensively, though his voice lacked the booming resonance it once had. He gestured broadly to the cavernous space around them. "We've had a rough few quarters. The supply chain issues, the overseas dumping. But the bones of this place are solid. You can put that in your report, Miss Cross." "I assess what I see, Mr. Vance," Elena replied, stepping up to the number 4 drop forge. The massive machine was silent, its hydraulic arms weeping dark, viscous fluid onto the concrete. "I see a lot of deferred maintenance. I see a Class 3 hydraulic leak here. And your overhead gantry looks like it hasn't passed a stress test since the Obama administration." Arthur flushed, a dark, angry red creeping up his thick neck. "I've got the parts on order. With the new capital infusion, the number 4 will be running at 90% efficiency by the end of the month. We're upgrading the pneumatic lines, overhauling the exhaust scrubbers. My men are ready." Elena looked at him, truly looked at him, through the smudged lenses of her safety glasses. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. The deep ravines bracketing his mouth, the dark, bruised bags under his eyes. He smelled of stale coffee, copper, and profound desperation. "It's a lot of money to sink into a relic, Mr. Vance," Elena said softly, the corporate mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Are you sure it's worth it? Sometimes it's better to just let the rust have it. Take the buyout. Rest." Arthur stepped closer, looming over her, a sudden fire igniting in his faded eyes. "You're an auditor. You look at spreadsheets. You see depreciating assets and overhead." He pointed a thick, scarred finger at a pair of men working a welding torch 50 yards away. "That's Miller. His father worked that exact same torch. His grandfather helped pour the foundation of this building. I don't bleed for the iron, Miss Cross. I bleed for them. This factory is a promise. And I don't break my promises. Not anymore." The words struck Elena like a physical blow. Not anymore. A jagged piece of her past threatened to tear through her carefully constructed alias. He was talking about her. He was talking about the promise he broke to her mother. The family he let shatter because he couldn't leave this dark, loud, suffocating place. She swallowed hard, forcing the emotion down into a tight, hard knot in her stomach. She raised her clipboard, the pen trembling slightly in her grip. "Loyalty is a noble sentiment, Mr. Vance. Unfortunately, it doesn't hold up in a bankruptcy court. I'll need to see the maintenance logs for the smelting crucible. Arthur's jaw tightened, but the fire in his eyes died down, replaced once again by the heavy, crushing exhaustion. My office. Top of the stairs. The files are on the desk. Thank you, Elena said briskly. She turned away before he could look too closely at her face, before he could recognize the slope of her jaw or the specific shade of her eyes. She walked away, the heat of the factory pressing against her back. She didn't go to the office. She had seen enough. She knew the machinery was failing. She knew the ledgers were a bloodbath. And most importantly, she knew her father was completely, hopelessly blind to the reality of his situation. He thought the money was a tool to rebuild. He didn't realize it was the anchor that would drown him. 10 minutes later, Elena pushed through the heavy steel exit doors, stepping out into the freezing, relentless Michigan rain. The cold air was a shock to her system, snapping her out of the suffocating nostalgia of the factory floor. She crossed the cracked, weed-choked asphalt of the parking lot and unlocked her sleek, black Mercedes, a vehicle that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of rust and ruin. Slipping into the driver's seat, she slammed the door, sealing herself in the quiet, leather-scented cocoon. She ripped off the hard hat and tore the safety glasses from her face, tossing them into the passenger seat. She ran trembling hands through her dark hair, taking a long, shuddering breath. Her phone vibrated in the cup holder. The screen illuminated the dim cabin. Caller ID Marcus Thorne. Elena stared at the name. The phantom benefactor. The man who owned her father's debt, and by extension owned her father's life. She pressed the button on her steering wheel to answer, the Bluetooth system picking up the call. Tell me you have good news, Evelyn. Thorne's voice flowed through the speakers. A rich, dark baritone that sounded like velvet over shattered glass. I'm looking at the facility now, Elena said, fighting to keep her voice detached and clinical. And, Thorne prompted, the faint sound of ice clinking in a crystal glass echoing on his end of the line. Is the old man celebrating his miraculous salvation? Elena looked through the rain-streaked windshield at the looming, shadowed silhouette of Vance Heavy Industries. Smoke billowed from the main stack, a dark stain against the gray sky. He took the bait, Marcus, Elena said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. He accepted the transfer. The lien is active. Excellent, Thorne murmured, a smile evident in his tone. He thinks he's bought himself a future. Give it 3 weeks. Once he commits those funds to the structural repairs, we trigger the default clause. The land will be ours by the end of the quarter, and we can finally tear that rusted monstrosity to the ground. Elena closed her eyes, a single tear escaping to mix with the grime on her cheek. She pictured her father, coughing in the shadows, clinging to the cold iron of a dying machine. Understood, Elena said. The trap is set. She disconnected the call, leaving nothing but the sound of the rain drumming against the roof, a relentless, heavy rhythm that sounded entirely too much like regret. The Bloomberg terminal bathed Elena Vance's face in a bruised, algorithmic light. It was 3:14 a.m., the hour when the city outside her penthouse window surrendered to the relentless, driving rain. Down below, Manhattan was a blurred smear of neon and wet asphalt. But up here, in the sterile, climate-controlled silence of her office, the world was perfectly ordered. Up here, the world was reducible to numbers, and numbers were the only weapons Elena trusted. She took a sip of espresso. It was cold, bitter as ash against her tongue, but the caffeine hummed in her veins like a live wire. Her fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard, the soft, rhythmic clicking the only sound in the cavernous room as she wove an invisible, impenetrable web. Chapter 3, Shell Games. Though to Elena it was less a game and more the architecture of a guillotine. For the past 72 hours, she had barely slept, subsisting on black coffee and the cold fire of vengeance. Her father's legacy, the Vance Foundry, was bleeding out. Decades of sweat, forged steel, and honest labor had been hollowed out by predatory loans, culminating in a staggering mezzanine debt now held by Marcus Thorne. Thorne, a vulture capitalist with a smile like a razor blade and a soul to match, was circling the dying factory, waiting for the clock to strike 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. That was the deadline. If the debt wasn't cleared, Thorne would foreclose, liquidate the heavy machinery, and pave over 3 generations of Vance history to build luxury condominiums. Elena was not going to let that happen. But a frontal assault was impossible. If Thorne knew Elena was attempting to buy out the debt, he would trigger the poison pill clauses embedded in the loan agreements, inflating the buyout price to an astronomical figure that not even her formidable Wall Street reserves could cover. Thorne was a predator who thrived on the scent of desperation. To beat him, Elena had to erase her scent entirely. She had to become a ghost. Her manicured nails clattered against the keys as she finalized the incorporation documents for the first layer of her defense. Aegis Meridian LLC, registered to a post office box in Wilmington, Delaware. A standard, unremarkable shell. But Aegis didn't hold the capital. Aegis was entirely owned by Blackwood Trust, a corporate entity nestled comfortably in the lax regulatory embrace of the Cayman Islands. Blackwood, in turn, was directed by a trio of proxy lawyers in Geneva who answered exclusively to an encrypted holding company in Singapore named Obsidian Ventures. Layer upon layer, jurisdiction upon jurisdiction, a matryoshka doll of corporate obfuscation. It was a masterpiece of financial engineering, designed to confuse, delay, and ultimately paralyze anyone attempting to trace the money back to the penthouse overlooking Central Park. Checkmate, she whispered to the empty room, hitting the execute key. On the screen, progress bars flared green. $42 million, her own money, leveraged against her personal portfolio, surged through the digital ether. It bounced from New York to Zurich, vanished into the Caribbean, and reappeared as squeaky clean, untraceable corporate capital in Delaware. The money was now in position, coiled and waiting to strike at the debt holding. A soft chime from the elevator foyer broke her concentration. Elena frowned, glancing at the security monitor. The brushed steel doors parted, revealing a man who looked entirely alien in the sleek, minimalist expanse of her apartment. Arthur Vance stood in the foyer, dripping rainwater onto the imported Italian marble. He was a man built of broader, heavier times, shoulders slouched under the weight of an old canvas work jacket, his hands calloused and stained with machine oil that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. He looked older than his 62 years, his face etched with the deep, permanent lines of a man who had spent his life watching his dreams rust. Elena stood up, the tension in her neck suddenly sharp. She crossed the room, the heels of her bare feet silent on the hardwood. "Dad," she said, her voice softening, losing the metallic edge it carried in boardrooms. "It's 3 a.m. What are you doing here?" Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. He reached into the deep pocket of his jacket and pulled out a crumpled, rain-dampened piece of legal paper. He held it out like a white flag of surrender. "Thorne's lawyers sent a courier to the house," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that smelled faintly of stale tobacco and ozone. "They're locking the gates at 5 today, Ellie. They're changing the padlocks on the foundry doors. It's over." Elena took the paper. The foreclosure notice was printed on heavy, expensive stock. The arrogance of it made her stomach tighten. "I told you not to worry about Thorne," she said gently, guiding her father toward the plush leather sofa. "I told you I was handling it." Arthur sank into the cushions, looking absurdly out of place among the modern art and chrome fixtures. "I know you're smart, Ellie. I know you play with millions like it's poker chips. But you don't know Marcus Thorne. He's not a banker. He's a butcher. He came by the factory yesterday, walked the floor, looked at the smelting furnaces like they were already scrap metal." Arthur dragged a heavy, trembling hand down his face. 3 generations. My grandfather built those furnaces, and I'm the one who let the fire go out." "You didn't let anything go out," Elena said, her voice hardening with absolute, unwavering resolve. She knelt in front of him, taking his large, rough hands in her smooth ones. The contrast was stark, the architect of the digital age holding the hands of the dying industrial era. Thorne engineered the supply chain collapse that squeezed your margins. He orchestrated the default. "It wasn't your failure, Dad. It was a trap." "Does it matter?" Arthur whispered, staring at the floor. "The debt is his. The paper is signed." "Paper burns," Elena said softly. She stood up and walked back to the glowing monitors. "Go to sleep, Dad. There's a guest room made up. When you wake up, the world is going to look very different." Arthur didn't argue. He was too exhausted. He merely nodded, a broken man carrying the weight of a rusted empire, and shuffled down the hall. Elena watched him go, a cold, protective fury crystallizing in her chest. She turned back to the screens. The trap was set. Now she just had to wait for the wolf to step into it. At 4 p.m. the following afternoon, the atmosphere in Elena's Midtown corporate office was electric. The storm had broken, leaving the sky over Manhattan a bruised, violently clear purple. Elena stood by the window of her corner office, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that felt like armor. Behind her, her chief legal counsel, a brilliant, neurotic man named David, was sweating through his collar as he monitored the digital escrow accounts. "Thorne's holding company just initiated the foreclosure protocols," David said, his fingers flying across his laptop. "He's filing the paperwork with the county clerk to seize the physical assets of Vance Foundry." "Let him file," Elena said, not turning around. She watched the traffic crawling along the avenue below. "What's the status of Aegis Meridian?" "The funds are cleared. The buyout clause in the mezzanine debt allows for a third-party purchaser to assume the debt in full before the 5 p.m. deadline, provided the capital is verified." David swallowed hard. "Elena, if Thorne traces Aegis back to you—" "He won't," she snapped, her voice like cracking ice. "Execute the buyout. Now." David hit the key. In a server farm in Delaware, a digital trigger was pulled. $42 million slammed into the escrow accounts of Marcus Thorne's holding firm, executing a flawless, unblockable buyout of the Vance Foundry debt. Because the debt was paid in full, with a 5% premium as dictated by the original, arcane terms of the loan, Thorne's foreclosure filing was instantly rendered null and void. "Transfer complete," David breathed, staring at his screen in disbelief. "The debt is ours. Aegis Meridian now holds the lien on Vance Foundry. Thorne is locked out." Elena finally turned away from the window. A slow, dangerous smile curved her lips. "Good." Less than 3 minutes later, the private line on Elena's desk began to ring. It was a number very few people had. David looked at the flashing red light on the console, then up at his boss. "Should I?" "Leave us, David," Elena commanded softly. The lawyer nodded hastily, gathering his laptop and fleeing the office, pulling the heavy glass door shut behind him. Elena let the phone ring 2 more times. She savored the sound of it. It was the sound of a predator realizing it had just become prey. She reached out and lifted the receiver, her movements deliberate and calm. "Elena Vance," she answered. "What did you do?" The voice on the other end was smooth, but the underlying tremor of rage was unmistakable. "Marcus Thorne." He didn't bother with pleasantries. He sounded breathless, like a man who had just taken a punch to the solar plexus. "I'm afraid you have the wrong number, Marcus," Elena said, her tone light, conversational, dripping with venom. "I'm currently reviewing quarterly projections. Can my assistant help you?" "Don't play games with me, you arrogant bitch," Thorne hissed, the veneer of the slick corporate raider fracturing entirely. A ghost company out of Delaware just hijacked the Vance debt out from under me. Aegis Meridian. My analysts can't find a single human name attached to the board, just a maze of offshore trusts. But I know it's you. No one else would drop 40 million to save a rusting piece of shit factory. If your analysts can't prove it, Marcus, then I suggest you watch your tone, Elena replied, leaning back in her leather chair. Slander is such an ugly thing in our circles. You think you've won? Thorne's breath rasped against the receiver. You just bought a sinking ship, Elena. That factory is a money pit. The unions are striking, the machinery is obsolete, and the supply lines are dead. You didn't save your father. You just chained yourself to his corpse. You're missing the point, Marcus, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all trace of amusement. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I didn't buy the factory to manufacture steel. I bought the debt to establish absolute leverage. Silence stretched over the line. Elena could almost hear the gears turning in Thorne's predatory mind. I read the fine print of the original loan contracts you drafted, Elena continued, her voice a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. You were so eager to trap my father that you cross-collateralized the foundry's debt with 3 of your own subsidiary logistics firms. You assumed my father would default and you'd absorb it all. But now that Aegis Meridian holds the senior secured notes. She paused, letting the silence hang like an executioner's blade. Aegis Meridian holds the collateral on your logistics firms. You! Thorne choked, the realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. Shell games, Marcus? Elena whispered into the receiver. No. It's an iron cage, and I just threw away the key. She didn't wait for him to respond. She severed the connection, placing the receiver gently back onto the cradle. The red light on her console blinked out. Outside, the sun finally broke through the bruised clouds, casting a sharp, golden light across her desk. Elena picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang once before a tired, gravelly voice answered. Dad, Elena said, looking out over the city that she had just bent to her will. Tell the foreman to fire up the furnaces. We're going back to work. The heavy iron door groaned on rusted hinges, the sound tearing through the suffocating silence of the subterranean bunker like a dying animal's shriek. Elena Vance stepped over the threshold, her combat boots splashing softly into a shallow puddle of black, stagnant water. The air inside the holding cell was a physical weight, thick with the stench of ammonia, rotting canvas, and the metallic tang of old fear. Her finger hovered intuitively over the trigger of her suppressed USP compact. Her muscles coiled tight, braced for the monster of her nightmares. Instead, the beam of her tactical flashlight swept across the decaying concrete walls and settled on a pile of filthy rags in the far corner. The rags shivered. Elena lowered the weapon, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat suddenly stuttering in her chest. Beside her, Marcus Thorne let out a low, derisive breath that plumed in the freezing, damp air. He didn't raise his rifle, his posture radiating a casual, lethal indifference. Well, Marcus murmured, his voice a gravelly baritone that echoed too loudly in the cramped space. The phantom benefactor certainly has a twisted sense of humor. Is this the prize, Vance? Is this the Titan we just risked a firing squad for? Elena couldn't speak. She took a slow, agonizing step forward, the beam of her light trembling just a fraction. The pile of rags shifted, resolving into the shape of a man. He was huddled against the weeping concrete, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, arms wrapped over his head in a permanent flinch. His clothes were little more than shreds of moldering fabric, hanging off a frame that looked hollowed out, as if the marrow had been sucked from his bones. Thin, wispy white hair clung to a scalp speckled with grime and sores.
Arthur, Elena whispered.
The name felt like broken glass in her throat. For 20 years, Arthur Vance had existed in her mind not as a man, but as a towering monolith of betrayal. He was the shadow that blocked out the sun, the cold, impenetrable wall of indifference that had defined her entire life. She had spent 2 decades turning herself into a weapon, forging her grief into a blade sharp enough to pierce the memory of the man who had walked out the front door and never looked back. The man in the corner slowly lowered his arms. He lifted a face smeared with dirt and dried blood. His cheeks were sunken, his lips cracked and peeling. But it was his eyes that struck the fatal blow to Elena's meticulously constructed armor. They were milky, wide with a hollow, animalistic terror. The piercing, arrogant azure blue she remembered from her childhood had faded into the cloudy gray of a dead sky. He didn't recognize her. He didn't even seem to recognize that they were human. "Please," Arthur croaked, his voice a dry, rattling wheeze. He threw his hands up, trembling violently, expecting a blow. I told them everything about the accounts. I don't know the cipher. Please, no more water. Please." A wave of profound, suffocating nausea washed over Elena. She felt the sudden, desperate urge to turn around, to run back through the maze of laser grids, tripwires, and armed guards they had just navigated in the corridors above. Echoes of abandonment. They rang in her ears, deafening and cruel. She was 10 years old again, standing on the splintering wood of their front porch. It was raining, a torrential downpour that soaked her nightgown to her skin. She remembered the red glare of his taillights bleeding into the wet asphalt. She remembered screaming his name until her vocal cords tore, her tiny hands gripping the porch railing so hard she got splinters that took weeks to fester and push their way out of her skin. He hadn't rolled down the window. He hadn't tapped the brakes. He had simply erased her. She had survived by hating him. She had survived by imagining him as a kingpin of deceit, a mastermind who had sacrificed his family for power and wealth in the criminal underworld. But looking at him now, a broken, pathetic shell of a man weeping in a puddle of his own urine, she realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't a villain. He was just a coward. And she had spent her life worshipping at the altar of a coward's ghost. "Get up," Elena commanded, though her voice lacked its usual steel. It sounded fragile, brittle. Arthur whimpered, pressing himself harder against the wall, trying to dissolve into the concrete. "I don't know the cipher," he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "Elena," Marcus said sharply, checking the luminescent dial of his tactical watch. "We don't have time for a family reunion. The shell game upstairs only bought us 20 minutes. The perimeter guards are going to realize the decoy explosions were a distraction. We have exactly 11 minutes to get back to the extraction point." "He thinks we're his interrogators," Elena said, her eyes locked on the pathetic figure before her. "I don't care what he thinks," Marcus replied, his patience fraying. He stepped forward, his heavy boots splashing loudly, and reached down, grabbing Arthur by the scruff of his ruined collar. With a single, brutal heave, Marcus hauled the old man to his feet. Arthur screamed, a high, thin sound of absolute terror, and thrashed weakly, his fists batting at Marcus's tactical vest with all the force of a dying moth. "Stop it!" Elena snapped, grabbing Marcus's forearm. The Kevlar weave of his sleeve was rough beneath her tactical gloves. "You're going to give him a heart attack." Marcus met her gaze, his dark eyes unreadable, entirely devoid of sympathy. "If he dies of a heart attack, it makes our exfil a hell of a lot easier, Vance. The benefactor's contract mandated we retrieve Arthur Vance. It didn't explicitly state what condition he had to be breathing in." The mention of the phantom benefactor sent a fresh surge of venom through Elena's veins. The mysterious patron who had hired her, who had manipulated her into taking this suicidal job with the promise of uncovering her past. They knew, Elena realized with sickening clarity. The benefactor knew exactly what Arthur had become. This rescue mission wasn't an act of mercy. It was an elaborate, sadistic punishment. The benefactor had orchestrated this entire scenario to break her, to force her to look at the pathetic reality of her trauma, to make her physically carry the dead weight of the man who had thrown her away. It was psychological torture, wrapped in a lucrative mercenary contract. "Let him go, Marcus," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the cold, dead tone she used right before she pulled a trigger. Marcus held her gaze for a long second, assessing the threat, before he unceremoniously released his grip. Arthur collapsed instantly, his knees buckling. Elena caught him. The tactile sensation of him was revolting. He weighed almost nothing. Beneath the wet, rotting fabric of his shirt, she could feel the sharp ridges of his ribs, the frantic, bird-like fluttering of his ruined heart. He smelled of decay and defeat. She wanted to drop him. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to throw him back into the muck and walk away, to finally be the one doing the abandoning. "Leave him," a dark voice whispered in her mind. "He left you in the rain. Leave him in the dark." "Arthur," Elena said, gripping his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "Look at me." Arthur's milky eyes rolled wildly before finally focusing on her face. He blinked. The terror in his expression fractured, replaced by a deep, terrible confusion. His cracked lips moved silently for a moment. "Ellie?" he breathed, the childhood nickname slicing through her chest like a serrated combat knife. Elena's jaw clamped shut, a muscle feathered in her cheek. "Don't call me that," she hissed, the words dripping with decades of unspent poison. "My name is Vance. You are going to stand up. You are going to put one foot in front of the other, and you are going to walk out of this room. Do you understand me? You came for me?" A single dirty tear carved a pale track through the grime on his hollowed cheek. They said everyone was gone. They said you were dead." "I am dead to you," Elena said ruthlessly. "Now walk." She hauled him up, draping one of his bony, trembling arms over her shoulder. She bore the brunt of his weight, his sour breath ghosting against her neck. It took every ounce of her professional discipline to keep from shuddering. Marcus had already moved to the doorway, his rifle raised, scanning the dark corridor beyond. "Moving out. Stay close to the wall. If he falls, you drag him. If he makes a sound, I will personally gag him." They stepped out of the cell and into the flooded subterranean tunnel. The water here was deeper, reaching their shins, masking the uneven, debris-strewn concrete floor. The only light came from the erratic sweeping of Marcus's flashlight and the sickly, flickering amber glow of emergency strobes pulsing at the far end of the hall. With every step, Arthur groaned. He was a dragging anchor. His bare, bleeding feet slipped on the submerged rubble. "I can't," Arthur gasped, his head lolling against Elena's shoulder. "Ellie, I can't. My legs. They broke my legs last winter. They didn't heal right." "Keep moving," Elena grunted, adjusting her grip on his waist, her combat boots finding purchase where his could not. "Why?" Arthur wheezes, coughing up a spatter of dark fluid that washed away in the rising water. "Why are you doing this? I'm not worth it. I never was. You should have left me here to rot." Elena stared straight ahead at the rhythmic sweep of Marcus's flashlight. She gritted her teeth so hard her jaw ached. He's right, she thought. He isn't worth it. Every labored breath he took felt like a theft. He was stealing her strength, just as he had stolen her childhood. She thought of the phantom benefactor, watching this unfold through whatever hidden cameras or proxies they had established. They wanted her to break. They wanted her to drop him in the water and prove that she was no better than the man she hated. They wanted the cycle of abandonment to complete itself in the dark. "I'm not doing this for you," Elena said, her voice a harsh, echoing rasp over the sound of sloshing water. "I'm doing this because I am not you. I don't leave people behind." It was a lie, of course. She had left plenty of people behind in her line of work. Mercenaries didn't survive by playing the saint. But in this moment, with this man, It was the only truth she could cling to keep her sanity intact. Suddenly, Marcus threw up a clenched fist, the universal tactical signal to halt. Elena froze, dragging Arthur to a stop against the damp, slime-coated wall. The silence rushed back in, heavy and pregnant. From the darkness at the far end of the tunnel, beyond the reach of their flashlights, came a sound. It wasn't the ambient drip of water or the groaning of the facility's failing architecture. It was the rhythmic, splashing tread of heavy boots, multiple pairs, moving fast, moving with purpose. "They found the breached blast door," Marcus whispered, clicking the safety off his rifle. The metallic snick was deafening. "We're cut off." Arthur began to whimper again, a pathetic, high-pitched keening sound. "They're going to put me back in the dark. Ellie, please, I can't go back in the dark." Elena looked down at the man who had ruined her life. He was a sobbing, broken mess, clinging to her tactical vest with desperate, skeletal fingers. The towering phantom of her past was gone, replaced by this fragile reality. She reached down, unholstered her USP compact, and thumbed the hammer back. "You aren't going back," Elena said, her eyes lifting from her father to the oppressive shadows ahead. "Mercy or punishment, I'm getting you out of here, or I'm killing everyone who tries to stop me." She stepped in front of Arthur, shielding his broken body with her own, and raised her weapon into the dark. The rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Thorn Capital's 60th floor boardroom did not merely fall. It attacked. It was a torrential, relentless assault of water and wind that turned the Manhattan skyline into a blurred, bruised canvas of charcoal and slate. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a vacuum of climate-controlled, sterile perfection. The air smelled faintly of ozone, expensive leather, and the subtle, sharp notes of bergamot from Marcus Thorne's bespoke cologne. Arthur Vance sat at the edge of the sprawling mahogany table, feeling entirely like a relic pulled from the mud and placed in a museum of modern art. His hands, resting on the polished wood, were a map of scars, calluses, and embedded grime that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly erase. They were the hands of a man who had built things out of iron and fire, not a man who traded invisible numbers on glowing screens. His suit, though his best, felt stiff and deeply inadequate in this temple of high finance. Across the table, Marcus Thorne reclined in his ergonomic chair, a picture of predatory ease. Thorne was a man composed entirely of sharp angles, a razor-thin jawline, perfectly tailored lapels, and eyes the color of frosted glass. He did not look at Arthur with malice. He looked at him with the chilling indifference of a hawk observing a field mouse. "It is a simple matter of mathematics, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that echoed slightly in the cavernous room. "The Vance Foundry has been bleeding capital for a decade. You've leveraged the land to the hilt. The grace periods have expired. The mezzanine debt we acquired last quarter is now in default." Thorne gestured languidly to the thick stack of legal documents resting between them. "This isn't personal. It's a mercy killing. Sign the transfer of the deed, and you walk away without the crushing weight of personal bankruptcy. You keep your home. Thorn Capital takes the acreage, we raise the rusted monolith you call a factory, and we build the logistics hub the city actually needs." Arthur's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his weathered skin. The foundry was not just a collection of bricks and oxidized steel. It was his bloodline. It was the altar upon which he had sacrificed his youth, his marriage, and, ultimately, his daughter, Elena. To hand it over to a corporate raider felt like signing his own death certificate. Yet, the numbers Thorne had laid out were absolute. The phantom benefactor who had mysteriously buoyed Arthur's accounts through a labyrinth of shell companies over the last month had suddenly vanished, leaving him entirely exposed. "You're stealing it?" Arthur rasped, his voice thick with decades of inhaled soot and unvoiced regrets. "You bought up the debt just to call it in. You engineered this chokehold." Thorne smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. I merely recognized an inevitability and positioned myself to profit from it. The world has moved on from men like you, Arthur. It's time you caught up to the present. The pen is right there. Arthur stared at the heavy gold Montblanc pen lying atop the contract. It looked like a gilded weapon. He reached out, his trembling fingers hovering over the cool metal. 60 floors below, a sleek black Maybach cut through the flooded streets, coming to a smooth halt before the glass-fronted lobby of the Thorne Capitol building. The rear door opened, and Elena Vance stepped into the storm. She did not flinch as the freezing rain kissed her skin. An assistant was instantly at her side with a wide black umbrella, but Elena barely noticed. Her mind was a perfectly calibrated machine, humming with lethal intent. For months, she had operated in the shadows. She had been the phantom benefactor, using her vast, self-made wealth to anonymously plug the holes in her father's sinking ship through a series of untraceable shell companies: Aegis Holding, Blackwood Capital, Vertex Trusts. She had played the shell game brilliantly, keeping Arthur afloat without ever having to face the man who had abandoned her to the cold reality of the world. She had wanted to save the Vance legacy without saving the father, a paradox that had finally ruptured. Thorne's aggressive, predatory maneuver had forced her hand. He had bypassed her defensive financial walls by launching a hostile takeover directly at the foundational debt, accelerating timelines through a loophole her lawyers had only detected 48 hours ago. To save the land now, the shadows would no longer suffice. She had to step into the blinding light of open warfare. Elena strode into the towering marble lobby, her heels clicking against the stone like the cadence of a metronome counting down to a detonation. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit like modern armor, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, immaculate twist. The security guards at the turnstiles moved to intercept her, but the sheer, radiating authority of her presence made them hesitate. "Elena Vance," she told the head of security, her voice devoid of inflection. "I am expected on the 60th floor." It was a lie, but she delivered it with such absolute conviction that the guard simply swiped a keycard and stepped aside. She stepped into the express elevator, the doors sealing shut with a soft hiss. As the cab rocketed upward, Elena watched the digital floor numbers climb. 40, 50, 55. Her heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. She had spent a lifetime running from the smell of rusted iron and the memory of her father's hollow, defeated eyes. She had built a multi-billion-dollar empire in European tech acquisitions and distressed asset management specifically to prove she needed nothing from him. Yet here she was, preparing to unleash hell to protect his rusted throne. The elevator chimed. Floor 60. Elena stepped out into the plush, hushed corridor. She did not pause at the receptionist's desk. She moved with the inevitable force of a rising tide, her hand pressing flat against the heavy double doors of the main boardroom. Inside, Arthur's fingers finally closed around the gold pen. He brought the nib down to the signature line, the weight of his failure pressing against his chest so hard he could barely draw breath. The heavy oak doors swung open with a violent thud that cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room. Arthur's head snapped up. The pen slipped from his grasp, leaving a jagged streak of black ink across the pristine white paper. His breath hitched, his eyes widening in absolute disbelief.
Elena,
Arthur whispered, the name tearing from his throat like a dry sob. Elena did not look at her father. Her gaze, cold and sharp as obsidian, was locked entirely on Marcus Thorne. She walked into the room, the silent footfalls of her stilettos sinking into the plush carpet, and stopped at the opposite end of the mahogany table. Thorne blinked, his arrogant composure faltering for a fraction of a second before he reassembled his mask of smug superiority. He knew who Elena Vance was, of course. Everybody in the financial sector knew the ruthless CEO of the Vance Cavalier Group, the apex predator of the European markets. What he did not understand was what she was doing in his boardroom. "Ms. Vance," Thorne said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. To what do I owe this unexpected intrusion? If you're here for a family reunion, your timing is remarkably poor. Your father and I are concluding a private transaction. There will be no transaction today, Marcus, Elena said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a dense, gravitational pull that commanded the space entirely. And you are not taking the Vance land. Thorne let out a dry, patronizing chuckle. I understand the sentimental attachment, Elena.
Truly, Ido.
But this is not a matter of sentiment. It's a matter of debt. Your father's company is entirely insolvent. Unless you brought a cashier's check for $42 million in that designer handbag of yours, this land is mine. Elena reached into the leather portfolio she carried and withdrew a single, slender manila folder. She tossed it onto the mahogany table. It slid with frictionless grace, stopping precisely in front of Thorne. I didn't bring a check, Marcus, Elena said, her eyes narrowing slightly. I brought a guillotine. Thorne looked at the folder, a flicker of genuine unease finally cracking his facade. He opened it, his eyes scanning the top document. As he read, the color began to drain from his perfectly tanned face, leaving behind an ashen, sickly gray. You see, Elena continued, stepping slowly around the perimeter of the table, her voice ringing clear against the backdrop of the howling storm outside. When my analysts realized you were attempting a hostile takeover of the foundry, I took a closer look at Thorne Capital's own liquidity. You've been highly aggressive this year. Over-leveraged, in fact. You borrowed heavily from offshore syndicates to finance your acquisition spree. Arthur sat frozen, his eyes darting between his estranged daughter and the corporate raider. He was witnessing a language he didn't fully comprehend, but the shift in power was palpable, heavy enough to alter the air pressure in the room. What is this? Thorne hissed, his voice trembling as he flipped to the second page. That is a notification of transfer, Elena said, coming to a halt just a few feet away from him. For the past 72 hours, while you were busy cornering an old man in a boardroom, my holding companies have been quietly buying up the primary notes on Thorne Capital's corporate debt. Aegis, Blackwood, Vertex, they all roll up to me. I didn't just buy the debt on the foundry, Marcus. I bought the debt on you. Thorne swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the silence. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Elena stated, her tone shifting into an icy, unyielding decree, I am your largest creditor, and according to the covenants of the loans you signed, any severe fluctuation in your liquid asset ratios triggers an immediate margin call. She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, invading Thorne's space. If you force the seizure of the Vance Foundry, you trigger a debt-to-equity restructuring on your own books. I will call in your loans by close of business today. You will be bankrupt before the markets open in Tokyo. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. The storm outside seemed to pale in comparison to the tempest Elena had just unleashed within the four walls of the room. Thorne looked up at her, his eyes wide with the realization of his own ruin. He was a shark who had just realized he was swimming in a pool of acid. You would burn down my entire firm over a rusted, toxic patch of dirt? Thorne asked, his voice a hollow whisper. I would burn down your firm for breathing the wrong way, Marcus, Elena replied, her expression terrifyingly blank. Do not test my capacity for collateral damage. You are outmatched, outcapitalized, and out of time. Withdraw the default notice. Release the liens on the Vance land. Now. Thorne's hands shook as he looked down at the contract Arthur had been about to sign. With a jerky, defeated motion, he reached out, snatched the document, and tore it in half. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He stood up, avoiding Elena's gaze, and walked out of his own boardroom, the heavy doors clicking shut behind him. The silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. Elena stood by the table for a long moment, the adrenaline of the kill slowly draining from her veins. leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. She slowly turned to look at her father. Arthur was still sitting in his chair, staring at her as if she were a ghost conjured by the storm. He looked older than she remembered, so much older. The fierce, unyielding ironmaster she had feared and resented as a child had been replaced by a frail, exhausted old man drowning in an oversized suit. "Elena," Arthur breathed, his voice cracking. Tears, bright and sudden, pooled in the deep creases around his eyes. It was you. All this time. The trusts, the extensions. It was you." "Yes," Elena said, her voice softer now, but still guarded, fortified by years of built-up emotional armor. Arthur slowly rose from his chair, his hands trembling as he reached out toward her, though he didn't dare close the distance. "You saved me. You saved the foundry. I don't know how to thank you. I don't know how to apologize for." "Don't," Elena interrupted, holding up a single, manicured hand. The sharp command hung in the air, halting Arthur in his tracks. She looked at the man who had chosen a dying factory over his own family, the man whose neglect had forged her into the ruthless weapon she had become. The hostile takeover of the land had been averted, but the true reckoning was only just beginning. "I didn't do this to save you, Arthur," Elena said, her voice laced with a quiet, devastating sorrow. She picked up the torn pieces of Thorne's contract and let them flutter to the floor. "I did this to save the land. Thorne doesn't own the Vance foundry anymore." She looked him dead in the eye, the weight of their shared, fractured history bearing down on them both.
Ido.
The Cathedral of Vance Ironworks was a monument to a dying god. Furnace number 4, the only heart still beating in the sprawling, cavernous belly of the factory, cast long, bruised shadows across the corrugated steel walls. The air was thick, a suffocating tapestry woven from the scent of ozone, oxidized copper, and decades of sweat. Dust motes the size of crushed pearls danced in the ambient, hellish orange glow of the cooling slag. Arthur Vance stood at the edge of the primary casting pit, leaning heavily against the wrought iron railing. His hands, scarred and calloused from 40 years of feeding the beast, trembled. He smelled of cheap bourbon and profound, inescapable defeat. The grease stained into the deep grooves of his face made him look like a statue that had been left out in the acid rain, eroded, tired, and crumbling. The heavy, rhythmic thud of expensive leather shoes on the graded catwalk broke the mechanical hum of the idling conveyors. Arthur didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The scent of imported cologne. Sharp, clinical, and entirely out of place in the soot-choked air, announced Marcus Thorne long before the man spoke. "It's a quiet grave, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He stepped into the light of the furnace, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to repel the ambient grime. "I expected more noise, a final, desperate gnashing of teeth. But I suppose even an old dog knows when to lie down and wait for the end." Arthur tightened his grip on the railing, his knuckles turning stark white. "The bank hasn't called the note yet, Marcus. The sun hasn't set on the deadline." Thorne chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that lacked any genuine humor. He walked to the edge of the pit, looking down at the dormant molds with the detached amusement of a vulture inspecting a fresh carcass. "The bank doesn't need to call the note. Horizon Capital absorbed the debt at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I told you, Arthur, you can't outrun the future. You're a dinosaur trying to fight a meteor. I'm here for the keys, and the title, and the satisfaction of watching you walk out of those heavy steel doors for the last time." "You didn't absorb anything?" A new voice rang out. It was a woman's voice, calm, melodic, tempered like high-carbon steel, carrying through the vast expanse of the factory floor with absolute, chilling authority. Both men turned. From the deep shadows of the southern loading bay, a figure emerged. The rhythmic click of stiletto heels against the concrete floor sounded like the cocking of a hammer on a revolver. She walked with a predator's grace, entirely unhurried, commanding the space with her mere presence. She wore an immaculate, tailored white trench coat over a sharply cut midnight blue suit, a stark, blinding contrast to the rust and soot of the ironworks. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless knot, exposing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw and high cheekbones. Thorne's arrogant smirk faltered, his perfectly groomed brows knitting together in confusion. "This is a restricted area. Who the hell are you?" The woman stopped 10 feet away, the orange light of the furnace catching the icy, predatory gleam in her dark eyes. "I am the meteor," she said softly. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat, retrieving a thick, leather-bound folio. She tossed it onto the heavy steel foreman's desk beside Thorne. It landed with a heavy, final thud. Horizon Capital attempted to purchase the debt from the First National Bank of Manhattan. The woman continued, her tone conversational but laced with venom. "Unfortunately for you, Marcus, Horizon Capital was severely leveraged. At 2:45 this afternoon, a consortium of international holding companies, Apex Holdings, Vanguard Trust, and Obsidian Enterprises, executed a hostile buyout of Horizon's primary creditors. We didn't just buy Vance Ironworks debt. We bought the bank that held it, and we bought the firm that tried to acquire it." Thorne stared at her, the color rapidly draining from his face. That's impossible. Obsidian is a ghost firm. It's a shell. I had my analysts look into it." "Your analysts are incompetent," she interrupted, her voice slicing through the air. "Just like your management style. You play checkers, Marcus. You look for the immediate jump. I spent the last 3 years building a labyrinth of shell corporations specifically designed to blindside you the moment you made a play for this factory. You don't own the paper on this ironworks. I do. And as my first act as the sole managing director of the newly formed Vance Global Conglomerate, I am liquidating Horizon's assets." Thorne looked at the folio, then back at the woman, his mouth opening and closing in soundless shock. The sheer scale of the financial violence she had just described was incomprehensible. It wasn't just a defeat. It was an absolute eradication of his corporate existence. "You have 30 seconds to leave my factory," she whispered, her eyes dead and cold, "before I have security throw you into the slag pit." Thorne swallowed hard, his bravado entirely shattered. He looked at Arthur, but the old man was staring at the woman, completely paralyzed. Without another word, Thorne turned and hurried down the catwalk, his expensive shoes echoing in a frantic, retreating staccato until the heavy steel doors slammed shut behind him. Silence descended upon the factory, save for the low, guttural breathing of furnace number 4. Arthur Vance remained frozen, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The alcohol buzz had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. He stared at the woman in the white coat. He looked at the shape of her eyes, the proud, stubborn tilt of her chin, the way she held her shoulders, a perfect mirror of his own posture when he had been young, arrogant, and invincible. The dust shifted. The decades fell away. "Ellie?" The name cracked as it left his throat, sounding more like a gasp for air than a word. Elena Vance did not smile. She did not rush forward to embrace him. She stood perfectly still, looking at the broken old man with an expression of profound, terrifying indifference. "It's Miss Vance," she said, her voice dropping the theatrical edge she had used with Thorne, leaving only a hollow, resonating cold. "Or, if you prefer, Madam Chairman." Arthur's hands let go of the railing. He took a stumbling step forward, his eyes wide, filling with sudden, desperate tears. The phantom benefactor, the mysterious angel investor who had been quietly paying off his vendors, keeping the lights on, setting the trap for Thorne. It wasn't a faceless corporation. It was you, Arthur breathed, his voice trembling with a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. You came back. All this time I thought I was fighting ghosts. I thought God had finally taken pity on me. But it was you, my little girl. You came back to save me. He reached out a grease-stained hand toward her, a pathetic, desperate gesture of reconciliation. He expected her to run to him. He expected the redemption that he had never earned but always believed he was owed. Elena looked at his outstretched hand. She didn't flinch. She just stared at it until the silence became so heavy, so agonizing, that Arthur let his hand drop slowly back to his side. "Save you," Elena repeated, the words rolling off her tongue like drops of liquid nitrogen. She took a slow step closer, stepping into the full light of the furnace. "Do not flatter yourself, Arthur. I didn't spend the last decade clawing my way to the top of the financial world, bleeding for every inch, starving for every victory, just to save the man who threw me away." Arthur flinched as if she had struck him. "Ellie, please, I know I made mistakes. I know I wasn't there." "You weren't there?" She cut him off, her voice suddenly rising, echoing with the force of a thunderclap. The icy facade cracked, revealing the roaring inferno beneath. "You didn't just miss a few birthdays, Arthur. You left me in a motel room in Reno when I was 12 years old. You packed your bags while I was sleeping, paid the room for 2 more nights, and drove back to this miserable, rust-eaten monument to your own ego. You chose the iron over your own flesh and blood." Arthur shrank back, his face pale, the memory of that dingy motel room rising up to choke him. "I was losing the factory," he whispered weakly, a pathetic excuse that had sustained him for years. "I had to come back. The unions were striking. I didn't have a choice. I thought your mother would come get you." "My mother was dead, Arthur," Elena screamed, the raw, unfiltered agony of the abandoned child finally breaking free. "She had been dead for a year. You knew that. You left me with $20 and a note that said, 'I'm sorry. I have to fix the machines.'" She took a deep, shuddering breath, her chest heaving as she forced the iron discipline back over her emotions. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and when she opened them again, the wounded child was gone. Only the CEO remained, the conqueror. "I survived," Elena said, her voice dropping back to that terrifying, calm resonance. "I survived the foster system. I survived the hunger. I learned how the world works. I learned that people are fragile, pathetic things that break under pressure. But iron only gets stronger when you put it through the fire. You taught me that, Arthur. It was the only lesson you ever gave me." Arthur wept openly now, the tears carving clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. He fell to his knees on the grating, his legs no longer able to support the weight of his guilt and his revelation. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, his head bowed. "I'm so sorry, Ellie. I lost everything. I lost my soul for this place. But you bought it. You saved it. That means you forgive me, doesn't it? You came back for your old man." Elena walked forward until the toes of her pristine stilettos were inches from Arthur's kneeling form. She looked down at him, not with pity, not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a metallurgist examining a piece of useless slag. "You fundamentally misunderstand the situation," Elena said softly. Arthur looked up, his red, tear-filled eyes searching her flawless face for a shred of mercy. He found none. "I didn't come back for you," Elena said, every word precise and deliberate. "I came back for the only thing in our family that ever had any value. I came back for the iron." She gestured to the sprawling, silent factory around them. "This is my forge now. Every beam, every rivet, every drop of molten steel belongs to me. I stripped it from the banks, I stripped it from Thorn, and most importantly, I stripped it from you. You failed, Arthur. You ran this place into the ground because you were weak. You loved the factory, but you didn't know how to protect it.
Ido.
Arthur's breath hitched. The devastating reality of his situation finally settled over him like a suffocating blanket of ash. He hadn't been saved. He had been conquered. The ultimate humiliation wasn't losing his legacy to a faceless corporation or a bitter rival. It was losing it to the daughter he had deemed unworthy of his time, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was stronger, smarter, and infinitely more capable than he could ever hope to be. What happens to me? Arthur whispered, looking around the factory that had been his entire universe. Elena turned her back on him, walking toward the master control console that overlooked the main casting floor. "You have two choices, Arthur," she said over her shoulder. "You can walk out of those doors and die a forgotten, penniless drunk in the gutter. Or you can put on a hard hat, grab a shovel, and report to the foreman at 6 a.m. tomorrow. You don't own Vance Ironworks anymore. But if you want to stay in my factory, you can sweep my floors." She reached the console and placed her hand on the heavy, red master ignition switch. Arthur stayed on his knees. He looked at the heavy steel doors leading out into the cold, empty night. Then he looked at the massive, dormant furnaces lining the walls. He was a ghost, haunting a machine that no longer recognized his name. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking as the final, crushing weight of his life's choices bore down on him. He wasn't leaving. He couldn't. She knew that. She had forged his prison perfectly. Elena Vance pressed the ignition switch. A deafening, mechanical roar shook the very foundations of the building. Furnaces 1 through 3 ignited simultaneously, sending massive, brilliant pillars of orange and blue fire shooting toward the vaulted ceiling. The conveyors groaned and ground to life. The ventilation fans screamed as they engaged. The shadows were instantly banished, drowned in the blinding, magnificent light of liquid fire. Elena stood on the catwalk, bathed in the roaring light of her new empire. The heat washed over her, but she did not blink. She breathed in the sulfur and the ozone, the scent of absolute victory. The iron was reborn, and it belonged to her.